Hmm? Who's in charge of presidential reconstruction? Abraham Lincoln, president. Exactly. And then when Lincoln dies, Johnson is going to take over. So it's just a word just to show you who is basically running the show in terms of Reconstruction. So the PowerPoint breaks it down into presidential and congressional or radical Reconstruction. Remember, the basic thing is forgive and forget. So Lincoln's plan is a 10% plan. 10% plan. Basically, what Lincoln is saying is that we need to get 10% of the former Confederacy to apologize, essentially, before they can be let back into the Union. This is part of his 10% plan, so I'll get to that in a second. First, you're going to see conflict between the President and Congress. Both the President and Congress want to be in charge of Reconstruction. And first, the President is in charge. Eventually, Congress is going to take control. Remember, the difference is presidents want to forgive and forget. The radical Republicans in Congress say, no, we need to punish the South before we let them back in the Union. That's the major difference. The President wants to forgive and forget, get back to business as usual as quickly as possible. Congress, especially the radical Republicans in Congress, are going to say, wait a second, those folks committed treason. They got to jump through some hoops before we just let them back into the Union. So there's a conflict developing from the beginning. Lincoln's plan, this 10% plan, allowed states to be readmitted to the Union. And so it's going to allow these former Confederate states to be readmitted to the Union if 1/10 of eligible voters swore loyalty to the U.S. So basically, that's not a high standard. Right? Only 10% have to say, we're sorry, we're loyal Americans again, let's go move forward. He could have said 50% have to say, swear loyalty. Could have said 90% have to swear loyalty, or 100%. He says only 10% have to swear loyalty because he wants to get back to business as usual, get North and South back together, reconstruct it as quickly as possible. Only 10% have to swear loyalty to the U.S. and accept the abolition of slavery. He's going to give general amnesty to certain high-ranking civil and military officers. So, okay, you were a Confederate general, you're forgiven. Now, he could have said you committed treason. Penalty for treason is death. Could have executed large numbers of former Confederates. They don't want to do that. They want to forgive and forget as quickly as possible, get the Union back together as quickly as possible. General amnesty to certain high-ranking civil and military officers. For our purposes, you're going to see a lot of former slave owners, they get amnesty as well. Some want to take slave owners' land and redistribute it to the former slaves. That's not going to really work out. Most are going to get their land back if they were landowners before the war. Presidential Reconstruction is criticized by some members of Congress as too lenient. Like you're not making the South do enough for all that they've done. Right? 4 years of war, they left the Union, committed treason in the eyes of many. Many also are going to disagree over the status of the free people. What are we going to do with all these African Americans? What are we going to do with all these African Americans? What's their role going to be? How many rights are they going to get right away? And down the road. As you know, Lincoln doesn't make it too long. Lincoln is killed in 1865, same year the war ended. Lincoln gets shot. Andrew Johnson takes over as president. He basically is going to continue the same types of policies. So this is why he's also grouped under presidential reconstruction. He also generally wants to forgive and forget, get the Union back together as quickly as possible. There were certain things that he was a stickler about, but he was a Southerner. So in some respects, maybe he felt a certain connection to the South, at least in some ways. Maybe connection to states' rights in certain levels. But he also wanted the South to respect the office of the president. He had a lot of issues with that. So there's going to be some tension between Johnson and the rest of the South. And there's going to be tremendous tension between Johnson and between the Congress. Between Johnson and the Congress. In fact, they're going to try to impeach him at one point. So conflict between two branches continues after Johnson becomes president. Johnson wanted to leave black suffrage up to the states. Johnson wants to leave this question of suffrage and really mostly African American rights up to the South. Let them deal with their own problem, basically. Extends general amnesty. Again, folks are going to be forgiven. He's seen as a champion of the South. We talked about black codes before when we went through the Reconstruction handout. I remember black codes are essentially laws specifically targeted towards the black population. Their goal was to control this newly free population. Yes, you're free, but there are certain limitations on that freedom. So like vagrancy laws that we talked about and other black codes, can't own land, various types of control, right? It's about control. Southern states began to pass laws that curbed black freedom and bore resemblance to the slave codes. Basic summary of what a black code was. And there are multiple types of black codes. In 1865, the South elected many Confederate leaders to represent them in Congress. So many of the same former leaders of the Confederacy get sent back to Congress to represent the South. Some said, oh no, they can't be allowed back in, right? They can't be given power again. But many of them are going to be invited back into power. Sort of tells you something, I guess, about where the region's head is at as well, right? Many Southerners feel like, yes, those are still our leaders. They did what we wanted them to do, right? They still represent our interests. So they're going to be sent back, and many of them are given power once again. And with the Republicans, were seen as the party that was much more friendly to African Americans, right? Kind of champion of the African American cause, especially the radical Republicans. This is why African Americans are going to vote for the Republican Party for decades after Reconstruction, well into the 1930s. So Republicans under Thaddeus Stephenson argued that Congress should take over Reconstruction, that the president should be in charge of it, but that the Congress should take over. And this ultimately is going to happen. Congress is going to take charge. So the textbook talks about that process. By 1867 or so, you get congressional Reconstruction, or radical Reconstruction, moving in that direction. Conditions for the free people are terrible. We've talked about some of them, violence and such. Other economic conditions are bad. Southern whites are waging a kind of guerrilla warfare on blacks. We've talked again quite a bit now about the use of violence. Violence was used for a purpose. It was supposed to terrorize people, limit their freedom. You don't want them voting. You don't want them exerting economic rights. So this is the reason for all the violence we've been talking about. This picture is an interesting one. It illustrates certain things.
Yeah, I had a question. You said radical government like Congress. You said the government
Southerners.
You said they would vote for the Republicans.
No, in terms of politics was very, very regional. The Republican Party really has no white support in the South. The only Republicans in the South are black people. They tried to vote for the Republican Party. So it really was a north-south kind of split. Remember, Abraham Lincoln doesn't even run in the southern states. He knows there's no chance Southerners are going to vote for him as a Republican. But he still wins because the North has more people. Now what's happening is the Republican Party, in some respects, sees this as an opportunity. Now you have 4 million freed slaves. These 4 million freed slaves feel like the Republican Party is the one that freed them. They're going to vote Republican. So a lot of these Republican politicians in the North say, we need to help them just so they vote for us. If we help them, this is a way to get 4 million more Republican voters. This is a way to get Southern Republican power. But in the South, the Democratic Party was the party of, the white Democratic Party was the party of the South. They controlled, they're the dominant party in the South. Now the problem was for African Americans is they were overtly racist. They said they're a party of the whites, this is the white man's country, all these sorts of things. They were sort of outright with it. So when you had a few Republicans go south and try to, start doing things, but often they had found themselves attacked by the Klan and such too. Right? Republican in the South it was dangerous to be a white Republican in the South. So it was very regional, very much a regional kind of split. But really both of their goals, they're politicians, both their goals is to get elected. So how are they going to do that? Many Republicans think empowering African Americans is the best way to stay in power themselves. Does that answer? This picture is an interesting one because it kind of reflects on a couple of the themes raised earlier in terms of the conditions for African Americans. It's this guy on the courthouse steps, basically. The selling of freedmen to pay his fine in Monticello, Florida. So again, think black codes, vagrancy laws. Remember, a vagrancy law said you had to have a job, Otherwise, you're breaking the law. You could get fined. If you didn't have money to pay the fine, you get thrown in jail. So this guy, maybe he was seen as a vagrant. Maybe he had a ticket, a fine. He couldn't pay it. He's being sold. So all these people coming to see him are saying, "Oh, I'm gonna bid on this guy to pay his fine." Or he has to basically sell himself. It's almost like re-enslaving him. And maybe a couple years earlier, this guy might have been a slave. And so you see these various mechanisms that are being put in place to kind of re-enslave folks and to get more labor out of them. He's going to have to work for somebody again. Maybe his former master is in that crowd. We don't know. But it's interesting to capture all of that with sort of photograph. Again, this tension between President and Congress. 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto. 1866, the Civil Rights Act, that's 2 years before the 14th Amendment. So Congress is trying to ensure certain rights for African Americans. So he passed the Civil Rights Act. Andrew Johnson says no. He didn't want this. He thought this was going too far. So he vetoes the Civil Rights Act. I'm sure as your answer, Andrew Johnson is standing on this issue. But Congress, the radical Republicans in Congress, are powerful enough by this point to pass the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto. So they passed it anyway. It gave federal statutory protection against black codes. So it's supposed to invalidate a number of these black codes. As we know, de jure de facto rights are often two different things. But Congress is trying to raise, radical Republicans in Congress are trying to raise African American rights, and others are trying to take those rights away. Different northern interests began to promote the enfranchisement of black men, and this is kind of what we were talking about, so your question actually is helpful here. There are a number of reasons why folks might want to help African Americans in the South. A Republican politician may not even like black people, but he might look at this as a political opportunity. Like, look, you got 4 million new voters. If we help them, they'll vote Republican. Some, maybe for religious reasons. Maybe, they're Christian. They thought, this is the best way to serve God is by enfranchising folks and helping them in various ways, educating them. There are a lot of, people that were moral in that sense. Economic reasons. Some folks thought, economic reasons you should empower African Americans. It's not that everyone was the same or had the same motivation for wanting to involve themselves, wanting African Americans to have the right to a franchise. Fight between Congress and the President continues. Johnson eventually is repudiated at the polls. Eventually going to try to impeach him at one point. They come to blows, essentially, Congress and the President in this period. But Congress is going to take over Reconstruction for a while. Again, for our purposes, and this is a sort of reminder, too, about the whole lynching discussion. I mean, that's a significant discussion in and of itself. I keep telling you that we want to pay attention to how people respond. In particular, how do African Americans respond, despite the fact that conditions are, in many ways, horrible. Right? Think about how significant something like lynching is. It's hard even talking about that today. I mean, I still read about this stuff, and it's like, think about how that's going to impact people at the time. You might think something as terrible as lynching is going to stop any sort of African American activism or rights. Not that I want to do anything. That's not going to be the case. Folks are going to resist these circumstances. They're going to resist the rise of Jim Crow from the beginning. African Americans are going to resist it. And they're going to find various ways to resist. Not everyone is going to resist the same way. Some resist like self-defense, violent self-defense if necessary. Ida Wells says, a Winchester rifle deserves a place of honor in every black home. They come to lynch you, pick a couple of them off. They'll turn around. Some folks say, well, that's not, you got to mob 1,000 people. You're not going to have 1,000 bullets. That's not going to work. Maybe nonviolent strategies might work better. Some folks say get the right to vote. That's power. Some folks say economic power. Get you a piece of land, get some money in your pocket, and you'll be respected for that reason. Some people say education. Get educated like anyone else should be equal in that sense. We're going to talk about a number of these responses. A number of these responses that are going to be significant. And people are going to continue to debate what is the best response to these circumstances. One of the circumstances and one of the responses we see immediately is this whole black convention movement. African Americans get together and meet. These conventions in various cities, sometimes at churches, sometimes outside of churches, mobilize politically against what they see happening to them. We have statewide conventions in the South in the first year after the Civil War is over, 1865, 1866. These conventions come together, mostly black men, at first demanding equal rights before the law. So they're very militantly demanding their rights, despite the fact that things are getting crazy around them. Churches and fraternal organizations are particularly important. Right? They're going to, as it says here, provide an infrastructure for activism. So you might already be going to church. That church may become a center for political activism, not just religion. You can go on Sunday, but you might come back on Wednesday for a meeting about the 14th Amendment. So churches have always been particularly significant in the African American community and culture. Always been important, not just for religious purposes. If you think about it, think about where many leaders have come from. Church, ministers, or in some ways are kind of a natural leadership group. Historically, that makes some sense. Maybe one of the first people in the community to learn to read might have been the minister. He's reading the Bible, he's preaching every week. Not that all of them were literate, but many are. A certain sense of independence. Right? If you are a minister, you believe you're serving God, and you see the society around you has a certain problem, you might be more willing to stand up to that problem. Right? You believe, look, you know what, no matter what happens up, God, I'm going to heaven. Maybe you're more willing to stand up to something like lynching. You can kill me, I'm just going to be with God. Still going to take tremendous courage, obviously, but there's maybe some reasons why there's some natural leadership coming out of churches. Fraternal organizations as well. Various types of fraternal and self-help organizations are going to develop in the black community that are going to help take care of the community. Remember, this is an era before something like health care, right? Disability insurance. So you have a number of fraternal organizations that do things to help individuals in the community. Lodge, various lodges, secret societies, and things develop among African Americans. For example, coworker gets injured. Everybody in the lodge might put together some money and say, hey, let's help him and his family so his family doesn't starve. Before disability insurance, unemployment insurance, any of that, folks are taking care of themselves and helping taking care of others in the community. They also develop leadership roles. Say you're a secretary of the lodge or president of the lodge, you start to take on a certain leadership in the community, which is going to be helpful for organizing politically. Mobilization is more advanced in places where federal troops remain the longest. Remember we talked about how in Reconstruction there are Union troops, Northern troops in the South, sort of watching, making sure things are going okay. So you may have more of an ability to exercise political rights when there are federal troops there supporting Reconstruction. Whereas if you're way out in the backwoods somewhere, it might be more likely to be lynched by exercising your right to vote and such. So again, residents of Reconstruction, maybe forgive and forget, the radicals think that the South needs to be punished. The South needs to be punished. Sometimes called congressional, sometimes compatible under the radical Republicans. Reconstruction Act 1867, this was also on the outline we went through. Remember, it divides the South into 5 military districts under the control of the general. There's troops there, this kind of stuff. They're making Reconstruction go early on. Eventually, they get tired of it and kind of say, okay, let's take the troops out, let's let the South deal with this issue. But early on, there's a lot of optimism about this radical period of Reconstruction for African Americans. Each state required to hold a constitutional convention based on universal male suffrage. So you have to hold up the Constitution based on, this is one of those interesting terms, contradictory in some ways, universal male suffrage. We already talked about what suffrage means, voting. Right? Universal, what's that mean? Who does that mean? Everybody. Right? So in some respects, I say this is a contradiction because you have universal male suffrage. Now, if it's just universal suffrage, that means everybody can vote. But universal male suffrage means all males can vote. So that's why I say in some respects it's a contradiction. Remember, women don't have the right to vote. 19th Amendment doesn't pass until 1920. So even white women or black women don't have that right yet. But it is a step forward. Universal male suffrage is a progressive step forward. Because back in the day, only white men could vote. Now black men can vote. And really back in the day, only upper class white men, with a certain level of property and all that, can vote. So you are slowly expanding those that have the right to vote. But this still excludes half the population of women. So keep that in mind when you see terms like universal male suffrage or universal white male suffrage, what it was previously. All states are required to ratify the 14th Amendment before they're going to be readmitted to the Union. So they have to ratify the 14th Amendment. Citizenship rights for African Americans, due process, all of that. So the radical, remember Lincoln was saying, just 10% of you, say you're loyal and you'll be back. The radicals say no, you need to do these certain things, ratify the 14th Amendment and these other issues. Now some have a problem with this. Think about feminists, for example, that say, well, this 14th, 15th Amendment is good for African Americans, but only African American males. 15th Amendment doesn't help black women, directly at least, doesn't help white women. So a number of folks say there's a problem with the gender language. We need to be pushing for more universal suffrage. There's a split in the movement that happens here with some that are not going to support the 15th Amendment. Some feminists are not going to support the 15th Amendment because it does not enfranchise women as well. But again, it is a step forward in terms of more and more people being allowed access. 15th Amendment, as we know, extends suffrage to black men. 2 African Americans are sent to the U.S. Senate. So you get all these black men that can vote. You see the fruits of that immediately. 2 sent to the Senate. Again, imagine the kind of revolutionary idea there. African Americans go from being in the system of slavery to electing people that look like them. 20 blacks served in the House between 1877 and 1901. Now, eventually, they're going to lose power and not appear for about 3 decades. But there's some hope, there's some optimism there in Reconstruction. And the chapter does a lot more in terms of talking about that process. There's a picture of some of the first black senators. 47 Congress is still the textbook, pretty famous picture. Blacks served with varying success as state legislators. Some are great. Many are, do the best that they can with, hostility. Many had been African American legislators had been literate before the Civil War. They had been educated or what have you. Some less so. Some doing what's in the best interest of their community. And there may have been some that were in there for their own interest. What happens, though, is this gets used against the entire African American population. So, for example, if there was an illiterate legislator, that's going to be stereotyped as all African Americans are illiterate. This is why we can't elect them, right? Blah, blah, blah. That gets used against the entire community. There were also many white Republicans that were, again, out for their own interests, maybe corrupt in their own way. So then the Democratic Party is going to use this and say, look, the Republican Party is corrupt, blah, 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 blah. All this gets read and used against the African American population. We talked a few times about South Carolina, particularly with its large black population, and how significant that's going to be when folks start trying to vote. The Union League, your question again, the Union League was really the mechanism for the Republican Party in the South. The Democratic Party was in charge of the South overwhelmingly. So this Union League is trying to raise the stature, the power of the Republican Party in the South, particularly with the use of African Americans. Depended on black men for the vote of Republican strength. So this only makes them more hated in the South, because they're kind of seen as empowering African Americans, with the idea that they're going to dominate the white South. And the Democratic Party, the white Democratic Party is going to use this kind of paint them with a broad brush. A couple things I want you to think about here, get your thoughts on this. Black women. Black women are particularly important and telling here. We need to pay attention to what they're doing, because, and this is why gender is so important. By understanding what black women are doing will give you a much clearer picture, a much more complicated picture about the period generally. I want you to think about some of these things. Black women in the black community. So black women have obviously this connection to the African American community. But in certain respects, their situation might be a little different than black men in some ways. Black women are active in getting out the vote and vocal in political discussion. Now, wait a second. We just said that black women can't vote, right? So you might think that means that black women have no power. It's not true. Not true. Black women, as we know, are going to exert power in a number of ways. They're going to be very creative about how they exert power in certain circumstances. It's okay, we don't have the right to vote. Black women might debate with black men any political issue. They might, be at the meetings talking about the 14th or 15th Amendment. They might challenge black men. And look, you have the right to vote. You need to get to that poll. You might have some black men like, you going down there? Lynch mob is waiting. You have black women making fun of black men. Oh, you're not a man? You're a coward? Helping them to the polls in some respects. They can debate, they can discuss, they can challenge, they can ask the same questions as black men in every sense, even though they can't vote directly. In particular, these black women are going to exert power with their husbands. Right? There's some stories about certain wives, black women, that said, hey, if you don't vote for the Republican candidate, don't come home. You're a coward, the locks will be changed. So they don't have the right to vote directly, but that doesn't mean they're without power. It does not mean that they're without power. They're going to exert a tremendous amount of power, campaign for folks, all these certain sorts of things. Come back to black women, think about how significant gender is going to be here. Civil Rights Act of 1875. Again, Congress is trying to push through these acts that in some ways are going to strengthen 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or clarify the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. So this one clarifies the rights of African Americans to freely use public accommodations. It passes. But then it's declared unconstitutional in 1883. So you get the Supreme Court saying, oh, that's not constitutional. That's overstepping the power of the Constitution. So already you're starting to see government and the Supreme Court starting to pull back some of the rights that African Americans are exerting in this period. You're already starting to see the end of Reconstruction, basically. This is a picture from the chapter when we talk about that. We'll come back to the black women question in a second. But the Freedmen's Bureau, we didn't mention so much about this. This is a very important organization. The Freedmen's Bureau is particularly important. Developed during Reconstruction. It's responsible for relief and rehabilitation. Remember, you got 4 million freed slaves that are suffering and struggling. They've lived through the war also. The South is largely destroyed. Right? African Americans are trying to figure out what their next move is. So this organization is set up to help the freedmen. What do? Do basic things, basic services, help provide food and medical services for folks that needed it. They establish schools, so this theme of education is particularly important. Supervise contracts. Remember, these former slaves now have to get a labor contract, work for somebody, so they can make a living. Yet they're getting taken advantage of, like we talked about. So the Freedmen's Bureau, probably the two biggest responsibilities were supervising labor contracts and labor disputes, and also helping education, starting schools and providing for education. Manage land. Now this says it's the first large-scale federal welfare program. First large-scale federal welfare program. This is interesting. In many ways, that's I think perfectly accurate. In some ways, might be misleading. First of all, the term itself. The term welfare has certain connotations to it. In contemporary society, mostly negative connotations. But basically, the term welfare just means government acting to help its citizens. The idea that the government has a certain job to help its citizens. We tend to think welfare, we tend to think African Americans. Usually programs like AIDS for families with dependent children and welfare in that sense. But that's never been the major form. It's never been the major form. Remember, welfare can refer to any attempt of government to help its citizens. Really sort of indicates a key split in American ideology. Should government stay out of individual affairs completely? Let people figure it out? Or does government have a responsibility to take care of its citizens? To take care of the welfare of the citizens. So now, for example, Social Security, right, or health care, or any number of programs you identify with government providing a certain welfare so that the society doesn't fall apart, basically. You can look at the Freedmen's Bureau then as a form of welfare, right? Government funded, but it's going to help this population that's newly freed, had been essentially oppressed, and had been enslaved for 250 years. You might say, well, it's fair. They provide this for 10 years to help folks out. But some folks say that's an issue. Again, think about, we'll come back to this issue of welfare. If you think about welfare and affirmative action, these sorts of terms, right? They have a racial connotation to them. But in many ways, it's incorrect. There are a number of programs that we could look at. The largest affirmative action program ever is probably the GI Bill, targeting a certain group of folks, providing certain privileges, rights in the society because of who they are. GI Bill is going to change this country. It's going to create a whole new middle class, especially after World War II. Those millions of soldiers returning back can get loans that can go to school and pay for it. They had been working class or poor, had no dreams of going to college. I'm talking about white folks. No dreams of going to college. All of a sudden, World War II allows them access. It's going to change this country dramatically. We don't think of that as welfare, though, right? It is. It's part of action. Or another term that comes up in this PowerPoint is Homestead, the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act had to do with giving out large pieces of land in this period, especially the 1860s, 1870s. Government wants people to settle, move west, and settle all this open land. Not necessarily open because Native Americans are there, but open, right? So to make the country grow, make the country great. Places like Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska. Give out large pieces of land. If you go there and settle it for 2 years, it's yours. Give out huge pieces of land to railroads. You build a railroad factory here, we'll give you 100 miles on either side of the railroad. They do that. Free land. Land grant colleges. Hundreds of acres. Places like Ohio State or Iowa. All these, if you look at a lot of these land grant colleges from the 1860s, huge pieces of land. Free land. Government. Welfare. But we tend not to think of it that way, right? Because it doesn't have the same racial component to it. Now, measure a little welfare check versus hundreds of acres of land. Doesn't really balance out. I think we tend to think of one as negative and one as positive. Got to be careful with terms like welfare or affirmative action. They have a longer history and they're much more complicated than we might think. All right, pivotal role of education. This is where we're going to sort of go next, right? One of the major African American responses to all these negative circumstances, these negative situations of Jim Crow. One of the things that folks say is get educated. 90 to 95% of African Americans are illiterate. At the end of the Civil War, well, the first thing they want to do is get literate. How are you really free if you can't read? Get everything that whites have, essentially. Educate yourself, and that's power. So symbolically, education is going to be very important. Practically, education is very important. You can't read your labor contract, you might sign something that gets you into trouble. So this could be very important. Someone like Booker T. Washington, for example, is going to throw a lot into education. We'll talk about that beginning Thursday, this whole Washington boys debate, for example. Federal Bureau works with private northern institutions and established black educators. So the Bureau is going to help start a number of schools. The number of religious organizations help start schools. The Baptists, for example, are really big in terms of starting schools. A number of HBCUs, for example, have a religious background to them for that reason. Educated black and white teachers came from the north. Many were missionaries. The number of black teachers steadily increases. So you have many whites coming north, especially white Republicans, coming south, to help educate African Americans. Black teachers that are helping to educate African Americans, and especially being educated right away, and then they become teachers themselves. By 1870, the task of education completely transferred to local communities and religious organizations. So although the Freedmen's Bureau might help start some of these schools, pretty quickly the Freedmen's Bureau is going to lose power, going to lose funding, and kind of go out. And now it's on the local community. So they tell these local black communities, okay, You have a school now, you need to raise money for it. You need to provide everything that's going to be there. So obviously, population just released from slavery is going to have very little funds to do so. Black schools are going to suffer because they're never funded equally with white schools. Black churches, again, we talked about this a bit already. Obviously, the spiritual significance of churches is important, especially even getting through folks, through slavery or something like lynching. Right? Maybe the only thing to get some people through was this idea that, okay, there has to be something better in an afterlife. Right? That's obviously important. But also the social significance, right? Churches become meeting places. They become political places where you can organize politically. Places where you go if you lose your job or need help in some way, material relief, spiritual relief. Some say that the first social institutions controlled by blacks, black ministers in particular, are important. Talk about how, in some ways, black ministers are going to be a natural kind of leadership group. Think about historically how many leaders have come out of the church. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Jesse Jackson, all these folks have a minister background. Not coincidental, I would say. Some of the things we'll talk about when we get more civil rights stuff later. For some, education is important. For some, economics. Some folks say, you know what, don't worry about so much about the book learning. Get you some money in your pocket. That's going to be the response of some to Jim Crow, to racism. How do you respond to racism? Get some money. Don't worry about black or white, worry about green. You'll be respected if you have as much money in your pocket as any white person. Power. Learn to do something. We'll talk a lot more about this when we talk about Booker T. Washington beginning next time. I decided that money is power. That's not a foreign concept. We'll talk a lot about that today. For many, though, economics meant land. Land. And this makes some sense if you think about the fact that the majority of these freed slaves were farmers, agricultural laborers. Their only skill might have been cotton picking. The first thing they want to do is get a piece of land so they can grow their own cotton, sell it themselves, be independent. Right? So many are going to connect land with this economic empowerment and vice versa, economic empowerment with land. I don't want to work for somebody else. I want to work for myself, be independent. I'd say see land ownership as a source of economic independence. Land ownership considered more favorable than wage labor. Right now we can get a job, right? That get paid and that makes you free. That would be more like going in business for yourself. I don't want to work for anybody else. You can kind of understand how a former slave might be a little hesitant to work for someone else. A little hesitant to sign a contract, I'm going to work for you all year. For many that felt a little too much like slavery. Even in the North, whites working in factories and such, right? Southerners called them wage slaves. Think of those millions of Irish folks working in a factory that make very little money, dangerous conditions, no health care, right? Losing fingers and arms in the factories and having accidents. When you had an accident, you just get thrown out. You're fired. You can't work anymore. Many Southerners made fun of that. They said, those are wage slaves. You don't want to be like that. African Americans are, seeing this and thinking about it for themselves. And many think, let me get my own piece of land. I don't need to prove working for somebody else. Talked about that Homestead Act a second ago. So the Homestead Act of 1866, in large pieces of land given out by government for folks to settle it. But blacks are still prevented from land ownership. So, for example, government's giving out all this land, but if there's a black code in place that says blacks can't own land, then only whites can get it. So these black codes are going to take away a lot of these rights. Even something like the Homestead Act is not going to benefit African Americans nearly as much as it benefits white Americans in this period. Women in the labor market. This is the part of the question I wanted you to think about from earlier. The role of black women here is pretty significant and interesting. Interesting things happening within the African American community, especially around gender and womanhood. This says, and I'll explain it, is an attempt to withdraw black females and children from the labor market. Attempt to withdraw black females and children from the labor market. This is going to have economic consequences. Basically what it's saying here, there's a move in the black community for black women not to go work outside the home. Black children not to go work outside the home. I want to ask you a question. Everybody is now a black male. You're a black husband in 1866. You got a husband, you got 2 kids. What might be your reason for not wanting your wife and children to work? Why might you say, nah, you guys aren't going to work? Safety, good one. Right? Sending folks out into a hostile, very dangerous place, lynching, rape, could be very dangerous. Safety is a great one. Anything else? What might be reasons why families might decide, or women might decide, to withdraw themselves from the labor market in this Reconstruction period? Safety is definitely one. Anything else? Wouldn't it be, just speaking from financials, would it be best to have as many people out there working as possible? Why y'all sitting here? Y'all could be out working right now, right? You made a certain decision, though, that it's in your interest to come spend an hour and 20 minutes with me today. These folks are making the same calculations.
Probably because women get paid as much.
That's definitely going to be true. Like we saw at the Oscars, that pointed this out, that notion that women make 78 cents on the dollar for every man. That's true. And it was true then, too. So black women would make less than black men and white men. But they make something, but it definitely is going to be less. That's true. Let me ask the question a different way. Why might a black woman choose not to go work? Remember, think about the historical moment. This is a moment where, in the mainstream feminist movement, white feminist movement, many women are arguing for the right to go work outside the home, perhaps for the first time. Many black women are saying, nah. Great. She said to prove a point or to educate themselves. What point do you think they might be proving? Think you're right. Huh? That they can do it and they should have the right to not work? That they need them? Okay. Yeah, and in some ways maybe it's showing how powerful you are. And the opposite too. I don't have to go to work. And again, remember, as many millions of white women are saying, look, I want the right to vote, the right to work outside the home. It was seen as unladylike to work outside the home. A lot of black women are like, been there, done that. We're working for years. I don't need to fight for that right. Women are enslaved too. Right? We know how to work already. They would say, like, I'm good. You can have that cotton. I got kids at home. Take care of them. Think about from the husband's perspective. Say you're a black male and you're making enough to where your wife doesn't have to work. Hard to imagine in 2015 where most folks need 2 people working. Barely make it. But there are some folks that are doing okay. Like, you know what? I don't want you to work. For many black men, this is a part of their masculinity. My wife doesn't work. She's home, raising the kids. It's kind of a middle class thing in a sense. Doing well enough where she doesn't have to work. Or your children, no, I don't want them working in the fields. They're going to school. Think about the American dream, right? The American dream has at least 2 components to it. One, work hard, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps so you can make something of yourself, all of that. That's true. But the second component of the American dream is the next generation should always do better. You always want your children to do more than you did. Right? You want to college, you want them to go get a master's degree. Get a PhD or something, whatever. You always want the next generation to do more. So a lot of these folks are withdrawing their children first from like, no, you're going to go to school. Yeah, we can use your labor, but you don't go to school. Right? So that you don't have to do this your whole life. Maybe you work in a factory. You want your children to own the factory. Or maybe never work in a factory at all if you can avoid it. Right? This is just like an American dream. The African American dream is bound up in the same way. But think about how gender might play there. Right? A lot of black women saying, I'm good. I don't need to prove to you that I can work. I've done that. I'm a lady. A lot of black women are saying, I'm a lady. which was a very, very revolutionary thing for a black woman to say in this period. And a lot of men say, yeah, my lady don't work. My boo don't have to work. Now, the way that people are going to react to that is really interesting. Really interesting. A lot of folks say African Americans are getting uppity in this period. They don't even want to work no more. Women, not working. They're lazy. Now, that's kind of the worst. To me, that's the worst. How are you going to call a bunch of former slaves lazy? All they did was work. All of a sudden now, hey, you serious? But this is what happens, right? Oh, they don't want to work. There may have been some other things going on. Black males take on a new assertive role as representatives of their families. So a lot of black men are going to redefine or define manhood for themselves. Remember, in slavery, you didn't really have control of your children, right? You called your son, and the master called your son at the same time. The child better go to the master, or both of them will get whipped. You weren't allowed to be a father. You weren't allowed to be a man in that sense. So a lot of folks now are like, my child's not going to work. I'm in control of it. I'm running this or whatever. Some of them take on very traditional roles, patriarchal roles, like what they saw in the society. And then you can talk about how that might lead to some problems too. What about when that black woman says, something that men doesn't agree with? How does that man respond to that? Should he respond like the rest of the society, where violence is acceptable? There's a problem with that. Conflict between men and women now as they're figuring out their new roles. So it's interesting, right? We talk about how it can go the other way too. This new assertiveness. So gender is important. Right? Gender is important. Many whites did not think black women should have the same fashion and leisure styles as whites. Now, black women, right? You like to look good. Right? Take care of yourselves, all beautiful and stuff. Get your clothes right. I read some really interesting things. A very interesting book by Tara Hunter that talks about this in Atlanta in the 1860s. Black women walking down the street after slavery is over, looking good. New dresses, suited and booted. That's a Manolo, what is it, blonde? No, they didn't have that. But nice shoes, hats, big hats, bright colors. And whites in the society are like, look at them. Who do they think they are? All these bright colors walking loud down the street. They think they're equal to us. A lot of hostility, especially towards black women, lipstick on, walking down the street. Well, these folks are like, look, I'm free. I'm as equal as anything. And husbands taking pride. Look at her. Looks good. Right? Looks as good as any woman in the society. But it's interesting how the society would respond and react. Right? As your wife's walking down the street looking fine, somebody yells at her or jumps on her, attacks her. Black man comes to her aid, beats somebody down, he gets lynched. You see how all this stuff fits into the period, right? All this stuff fits together. There's a new assertiveness yet. That assertiveness came with some limitations. There's a lot of stories about these black women that no longer know their place. They're acting above themselves, blah, 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 quote, unquote. Majority of black women still are going to work outside the home, right? First in the field, sometimes alongside husbands. Later on, black women become the primary domestics working in other people's homes. And then especially once they've been in the war, they'll be mostly in domestic work. We talked about sharecropping. We sort of know what that is. We're going to be outlined and it's come up again in our conversations here. It's compromise between landowners that didn't have money to pay but had land, and they need the labor of African Americans. African Americans needing to work for somebody, for the most part, because they don't have land. So that's how sharecropping develops. But we also talk about how it has problems. Right? What happens when that landowner doesn't pay you? You can't go to court, or you signed a bad contract. They just want to rip you off. The system helps the South recover, but it's not very helpful overall for African Americans. Right? It does help the South recover quickly. So pretty quickly, the South is producing as much cotton after the war as it was before the war. But are African Americans benefiting from that? Mostly no. Freedmen's Bank. Freedmen's Bank was an institution, a bank set up supposedly to help the freedmen. Chartered by the federal government. for blacks to use, encourage blacks to save money, right, to spend wisely, to be thrifty. Some of the people in charge are shady, right? You got folks taking advantage of African Americans. Ultimately, the bank's going to fold, go out of business. Folks are going to lose money. Frederick Douglass and others are going to try to save it, but it does close in 1874. And obviously, this is going to leave a bad taste in people's mouth, right? Why would you put your money in the bank? It's going to go bankrupt. But African Americans see this as we're never going to get a fair shake in this society. See the same thing happen around the Great Depression with all Americans. Remember in 1929, when the banks closed, they closed with people's money in it. People lose their savings. So if you have grandparents of that age, they'll remember. They probably still got money under the mattress. I don't put it in a bank. But a lot of folks that are still nervous about banks. This was in an era before FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If you walk into a bank now, you'll see a sticker on the bank. It says FDIC insured. That came out of the 1930s. Basically, if that bank goes out of business, the government will give you your money back, up to $100,000 initially. Now they've raised it up to $250,000. So if any of you got $250K in the bank, you're okay. But the government will pay you back, essentially, so you have confidence in the banks. This was before that. Bank went out of business, you were out of luck. End of Reconstruction. We talked about some of the reasons for Reconstruction and why the dates, 1876, 1877. Democratic Party is revived in the South after amnesty is given to most Confederate leaders and most ex-Confederates. The violence, in some ways, violence does work. Right? It helps keep people from voting in large numbers. It's going to remove power from those that had gotten some levels of power. Legal and extra-legal means used to deny blacks, so you can pass laws or you can lynch people. Same kind of result. The Klan is one organization. This organization called the Knights of the White Camellia. Another group, kind of like the KKK, very similar. Those are the two most powerful use violence to stop people from participating in politics. Also, the North is getting tired of Reconstruction. So as you get more and more violence, you get the Southerners saying we want to, control what happens with the race problem or the Negro problem. You also have Northern Republicans saying, no, but let them have it. We've been doing this for 10 years. Let it go. Efforts to outlaw organizations and stop the violence are unsuccessful. Some societies or some states have more success than others, especially those states with larger black populations. But those were also the states where folks are afraid of those larger black populations. So you might see a few different moves. Despite black defiance to the intimidation, blacks began to stay at home, and political power shifted to the Democrats. So if you don't vote Republican in the South, the Democratic Party is already dominant in the South, so it'll become even more dominant in the South. And that was kind of the goal. There is corruption in some Republican government. Remember, some Republicans were just out for themselves anyway. They didn't really care about African Americans. So some were just trying to make money. Corruption is going to hasten the end of Reconstruction, end of radical Reconstruction. You get the death of old anti-slavery leaders that had been radical Republicans. They're getting older and older and slowly dying off in this period. The Republican Party is thinking, let's try something else. Various Supreme Court decisions are being passed that are rolling back the gains of Reconstruction. 1875 Supreme Court decisions are weakened black voting rights. These are a couple of cases, Supreme Court cases they'll talk about that are going to weaken black rights. And then 1876, remember the election that happens in 1876, controversy over who won. Republicans and Democrats are competing. They make a compromise, essentially. Republicans promise to withdraw troops, assist the South in obtaining federal subsidies, so it's money, is getting rid of the troops, to allow for better representation. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, is elected president. He withdraws the troops. Congress is going to remove other restrictions. So this is why we kind of see the end of Reconstruction by the election of 1876 and the federal troops removed by 1877. All right, I know that was more detail than you need, but what I wanted to do was go through one of these PowerPoints and show you, even though it's just bullet points. Many of these things are things we already talked about, but they're also key to thinking about significance. Yeah, this is specific information, but it's still all connected to these bigger picture topics. which you are well equipped to deal with now. Think about how this reconstruction is a reconstruction of an imagined community. One country. Was two becomes one. Think about how reconstruction is a tipping point. Think about how it has to do with the social construction of race, class, and gender. How it has to do with real consequences of race, class, and gender. All this stuff, fits together. I want you to see those connections. Again, all you have to do for this first assignment